Welcome to the Paul Chandler Show, everyone. I'm host Paul Chandler. In tonight's episode, we're going to be looking at ICD-10-CM books. And why are we going to do that? So on the professional outpatient coder side, we use the three main coding books: CPT, ICD-10-CM, and HIPAA. While the CPT book, that is all designed by the AMA, they own it, they copyright it, yep, that's all theirs. There's several different publishers that produce an ICD-10-CM and a HIPAA book. So tonight we'll be covering ICD-10-CM. On the next episode, we'll be covering HIPAA. So what I mean by covering ICD-10-CM books is that we'll be looking at several different publishers, because that's one thing you want to make sure that when you have a coding manual that you'll be using, you want to find one that you like. Now, there are a lot of similarities between each of the publishers, but there's also some differences as well. So tonight's episode of the show, we'll be looking at comparing the different publishers for ICD-10-CM books, the pros and cons, so that way that you'll be able to know what book you like, and that way you can use it for next year. So stay tuned, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show, where today we're going to be looking at 5 different versions of 2021 ICD-10 books, because that's one thing that's very important when you're looking at an ICD-10 book to purchase, to make sure that it is one that has everything that you need in it and you also are comfortable with the layout. So we're going to be looking at, first today, the Optum 360 version, and then we're also going to be looking at the AMA, AAPC, Decision Health, and Elsevier. So first here with the Optum, and you see that in the 2021 version, they already have the 2021 guidelines included in it. And with the Optum ones, so they have the ICD-10 guidelines in front, and it's pretty much standard how all the other publishers have it. Nice small size font print. And yes, it does seem like that the font gets smaller and smaller every year, and that's probably because it does. So with Optum, they put the ICD-10 guidelines in the front, and you can see how they have this black trim on the side here for the guidelines. And then after the ICD-10 guidelines, then they have their index to diseases and injuries, 3 columns with two gray vertical lines going down to help you with the indents, and the kind of like a medium to dark color shade gray on the side for this index. Now with the Optums, they do the ABCs, so the XYZs. Then after all the alphabeticals, then they have the neoplasm table, which brings you to back to like a black gray trim side here. And they have the 7 columns with the location and the different classifications as far as the neoplasms. And then after the table of neoplasms, then they have the table of drugs and chemicals. What you can see is like the light, back to the light gray trim here on the side, and still the standard 7-column format. Then after their table of drugs and chemicals, then they have their external cause index, which they still have, again, the 2 vertical gray lines and like a dark blackish kind of trims on the side here to divide up this index. Then after the external cause index, then they begin with chapter 1. So just like how pretty much all publishers do, they do have a different color for each different chapter number. So that is easy to help. And in the beginning of each chapter, they do have chapter-specific guidelines with coding examples. So they do copy the ICD-10 guidelines for this specific chapter, the guidelines in the beginning of each code section for the chapter. So for example, there was chapter 1, and then chapter 2 has chapter-specific guidelines at the beginning of the chapter for neoplasms. Then the neoplasm codes there. So they do place all of the chapter-specific guidelines twice, in the front of the ICD-10 book with the guidelines themselves, and back here in the beginning of each chapter. Now then with the Optum version, they have then all of their codes. They do have appendices in the back Because that's one thing that appendices are be different with every publisher. So in the back of the Optum, we have Appendix A, valid 3-character ICD-10-CM codes. Appendix B, pharmacology list for 2021. And then Appendix C, codes for long-term drug use with associated drugs. So this will help if you know the name of the drug or the medication, listing it to what appropriate Z code it is for the long-term and current use. And then they have their anatomy illustrations in the back of the book. Because most ICD-10 publishers will include additional anatomy illustrations, some put it in the front, and Optum puts theirs in the back. So that's a quick look at the Optum ICD-10-CM 2021 version. Now looking here at the AMA, and this is identical. So I'm not going to be flipping through all these pages, because that's one thing that what AMA does is while they make their own CPT book and the current procedure terminology book, how that is copyrighted by the AMA, for their ICD-10 books and their HCPCS book, they simply just white label from Optum. And what white labeling is, that is they pay Optum to print their books, and the only difference is they put the cover is in all the labeling instead of Optum, they do it on AMA, and then AMA will sell it on their side. So for example, at the bottom here, I have the AMA ICD-10-CM 2021, and then on the top here, I have the Optum version again, and you can see they're identical. So as far as Optum and AMA, their ICD-10 books, they are completely identical. So if you like how those are formatted, my recommendation is go whichever one you can find for cheaper. So now while those have the same layout, the other publishers are different. So next up is AAPC. They started doing their own coding manuals a few years ago. So with the AAPC ICD-10, they do have yellow selected tabs in front you can use. And they have their ICD-10 guidelines also in the front. And with the guidelines then, they do have some of these charts as far as helping you like decision tree type charts. Now what is different though with AAPC, like I said, sometimes anatomy illustrations are in the back, sometimes they're in the front. AAPC puts theirs in the front. So we have additional anatomy illustrations all in the front of their version of the book. Then after the anatomy illustrations, then we have the index to disease and injuries. And here we still do have 2 vertical lines to help you when we're drilling down or dropping down and indenting, whatever you want to call it. The only difference though is here AAPC uses a yellow shade. They use a yellow color instead of gray. Some people like that it's yellow and not gray. Some people prefer the gray. It's all based on personal preference. But the AAPC does have those 2 vertical lines there. And just like how Optum and AMA is, at the end of their ABC XYZs, then they have the neoplasm table. Now notice though, we had with the Optum and AMA version, on the opposite page of where the neoplasm table began, we had some white space here to be able to put in some additional notes for neoplasms. But the 2021 version of AAPC's ICD-10-CM does not have that. You got about an inch left there as far as notes. But we have the light gray trim for the index to disease and injuries, the alphabetical index as I call it. The black trim on the side here for the neoplasm table. Then after the neoplasm table, just like how Optum and AMA are lined up. After the neoplasm table here on the left, we have the table of drugs and chemicals on the right, like a light gray trim here side. And like the other 2 books as well, after the table of drugs and chemicals, then we have the index to external causes and injuries, a separate index with a kind of dark gray, like a light black trim on the side here. And notice though the 2 vertical yellow lines as well to help down with the dropping down and indenting to get more specific. And then after the index to injuries, Then we have the tabular list in the back. What is different though with the AAPC version is they do not copy their ICD-10 guidelines that are chapter specific. They do not have them at the beginning of each chapter. So if that is one thing that you like about the Optum and AMA books, notice that it is different with the AAPC. They still have a different color. Of course, the colors are different because that part doesn't matter, but the colors are different for every chapter. It's just that the AAPC does not copy again the guidelines at the beginning of their chapter for easy reference. And as we're looking through, so that was for chapter 1. And we see here for chapter 2, there's no additional notes there. And we do have the musculoskeletal system. It's not the ICD-10 guidelines, but they do have anatomy of the musculoskeletal system, though, in the beginning of this one chapter, just for anatomy references there. And then at the end of all the codes, and with every appendix in the back being different, here for AAPC, their Appendix A are the Z codes for long-term use of drugs. So just like we had before at Optum and AMA, we have the name of the drug, and we have the appropriate Z code it would link it with their long-term current use of what type of drug classification it is. So we have that for Appendix A. Appendix B in the AAPC version is the symbols for 7th character codes. In Appendix C, is the summary of 2021 CM changes, where it lists all the new codes. Just as a quick reference, all of the new codes for 2021 and all of the revised codes, as well as the deleted codes, just for a quick reference there. So while that is the AAPC version of ICD-10-CM for 2021, here we have the Decision Health version. And with Decision Health, so they have their ICD-10 guidelines in the front. Notice that the font size is larger in the Decision Health version. So they have the ICD-10 guidelines in front, and then after that, they have their index to diseases with a light gray trim on the side. Notice with Decision Health, though, there is no gray nor yellow vertical lines with the dropping down and indenting. So if you're, how do I say, it's you may need a ruler basically to help you with the dropping down and indenting. Like I said, since Decision Health does not put vertical nor horizontal lines. And what is also different is while all the other publishers put the neoplasm table at the end, so we go ABC through XYZ and then the neoplasm table, Decision Health puts their neoplasm table where neoplasms are. So this is how we used to do it under the old ICD-9 format. When we switched to ICD-10, all the other publishers put the neoplasm table at the end, but Decision Health kept theirs where the word neoplasm is, and that's fine. It's just noticing it's a different spot for this publisher. But then we resume the alphabetical index, ABC, XYZ. So then at the end of the Z's, then we get the table of drugs and chemicals. And notice though, it's the same color gray between the alphabetical index and the table of drugs and chemicals. Although the neoplasm table is a little bit different shade of gray. After the table of drugs and chemicals, then we have, where it's the same location for all other publishers, the external causes index. Again, notice though, again here, no vertical gray or yellow lines. And then starting with chapter 1, certain infectious and parasitic diseases. Same format where it's a different color for every chapter, although you see here Decision Health sticks with the blue, green, and yellows. And at the beginning of each chapter, unlike Optum and AMA, but just like how AAPC was, they do not copy again the chapter-specific guidelines for that section. So it's all referenced just in the front. And then after all of the ABC through XYZ for the codes. Then in the back, then we do have additional anatomy illustrations. And this time, though, like Decision Health puts theirs in the back, like how Optum and AMA does, while AAPC's are in the front. And then they don't do appendices in the back, but after the anatomy illustrations for Decision Health, then they also do have a muscle and tendon table, which helps if you know the name of the muscle or the tendon, helps you find the location where it is and what action it does. So that's the differences with the Decision Health. And last but not least, the last one we're going to look at is the Elsevier version for the 2021 ICD-10-CM. So with Elsevier, notice no tabs in the front also. And after the symbols and the updates and all that good stuff, guide to the updates. So they do have in front, which is unlike the other publishers, a guide to the updates for 2021. And then they have the ICD-10 guidelines, which is in a reddish pinkish side bordered trim. And also too, in this font is more of a standard size font, if you will, that we also saw in Decision Health. So this is larger size font for the guidelines than Optum, AMA, and AAPC. But we have the guidelines in the front, and with a red trim. Then we have a green trim on the side for the additional anatomy illustrations. And then after the anatomy illustrations, then we have the index to diseases and injuries with a gray trim on the side here. And they do have, it is a little bit thinner, but they do have two gray vertical lines there that can help us with the placement while we're going down and indenting. Then after the ABC, XYZs at the end, then we have the neoplasm table. And also this is a more colorful table than all the other publishers. And there is a blank white space on the left side for additional notes for neoplasms. Then after the neoplasm table, then we have in the purple trim, the table of drugs and chemicals. Again, notice a separate page on the left for notes for this table, because they have a separate actual table header page. After this kind of purplish for the table of drugs and chemicals. Then for their external cause of injuries index, we have it with a orange. We have an orange trim on the side. And again, you can see here the two vertical lines to help with that placement. And then we begin the tabular list. So now with the tabular list, notice though where the codes begin. Before the codes, like we had in Optum and AMA, they do copy the chapter-specific coding guidelines that apply to that individual chapter in the front. However, though, this is more of a standard size font, if you will, that the other publishers use. So this size font is a little bit smaller than they have in the front of the book, but it's still good to have access the chapter-specific guidelines copied again in the beginning of the chapter itself, so you're not flipping back and front all the time. And you have different color for each of the different chapters on the side trims. And then after the ABC, XYZs, and there's no appendices in the back. So as you can see, though, with the different publishers, again, and going in reverse order for how we looked at it, we last looked at the Elsevier 2021 ICD-10-CM. Before that was Decision Health. Before that was AAPC. And before that was AMA, which is white labeled from the one before that for Optum. So I do thank you for spending the time watching this a little bit of a longer video, but we wanted to show you the main 5 different publishers for ICD-10-CM coding books for 2021. And hopefully after this video, you are more informed on which book you like the most, and you can get the one that works for you.
So welcome back, everyone. I hope that you learned all the differences with ICD-10-CM books with the different publishers and that you've decided on which one that you like. Now, that's one thing too as far as the coding books. Remember, CPT, ICD-10, and HIPAA. So in the next episode, we'll be looking at the HIPAA book. So just like always, thank you for watching the Paul Chandler Show and have an awesome rest of your night.